Dr. Giles Yeo is the most incredible scientist, biologist at Cambridge University, and he is a fountain of knowledge when it comes to all things nutrition and health. He's the author of the most incredible books. He's got 2 now, and that is Why Calories Don't Count and Gene Eating. I'd highly recommend getting a copy of these books. I learned so much from them, and we'll touch on many of those subjects today. He's a geneticist studying the brain's impact and control over food, so why we eat what we eat, and can we really dictate the changes that we want to make and override the brain? He's also a professor of neuroendocrinology at the Medical Research Council Metabolic Diseases Unit and scientific director of the Genomics Transcriptomics Core at the University of Cambridge. So without a doubt, let's get into the most incredible conversation. I cannot wait. I've been waiting all year for this. Hello, Giles.
Hello.
Hi, we've just had a fantastic catch up. It's been, I would say, has it been like 2 years since I last saw you? A year? Time flies.
Was it pre-COVID or did we actually speak post-COVID?
Do you know, I don't actually know.
I know. Let's not talk about it.
Let's not go the
Let's not do
COVID
that.
time
No.
warp. I'd love to start by just asking you if your perception on your area of work in terms of, discussing weight in particular, obviously genetics and that side of things, has it changed in the last few years? Have you noticed anything, like any trends or anything that's brought your attention to it that's different?
Few years or since the beginning of my career? I think there's two answers.
Let's do beginning of career.
So beginning of career, it has changed hugely, actually for everybody, including myself. Because when we first started, and I've been in the business now for nearly 30 years, when we first started studying obesity, actually, we did not know what, aside from people eating too much, and even then, people were wondering what the deal was. Was it a stomach thing? Was it a fat thing in terms of where the control came from? Was it a brain thing? Was it an eye thing? Was it a nose thing? And you might think that it's obvious, but because you didn't know, right? Whereas since then, we now know that actually body weight and therefore food intake is very much a brain control thing. And that was probably the hugest change. We knew about the genes before then, but since then, we know a lot more about it. We know a lot more about specific mechanisms, specific genes, and for some of the genes, at least, specifically what they do. So it's completely changed within the profession of what we think about obesity, how we should manage it, and eventually how we then treat it.
Yeah. It's a huge, because there's so many factors involved, aren't there? You can't just pinpoint one area. And I remember you giving a talk discussing a particular gene that means that person could always have a second slice of cake compared to the neighbour. I think that's the analogy you used, or the person that couldn't. Could you explain to our listeners why it is a faceted problem, why there are all these different areas in our lives that can contribute to being obese or overweight?
I think the interesting thing about obesity or being overweight is that it seems a simple thing. And in very many ways, it sort of kind of is, because it's a public thing. You can see it, you can point it out.
Yeah.
There is an element of physics to it. So you do have to eat too much in order to gain weight. That is always going to be true. And so people think, so why are you researching it? What are you doing? The answer is because the roots to obesity are completely complex. I mean, they're so complex. So yes, you do at some point have to end up eating more carbons. Okay, you need to get more food into you. But why? And the roots to that are so, you could be because you're more hungry. That is what we typically think. It could be because you're less full. Different things, different pathways. It could be because of your reward pathways, because you are attracted to yellow M's on the side of the motorway. It could be because you don't think when you eat. It could be because you eat when you're stressed. It could be because you're poor. Yeah. It could be because you work. It could be anything, and then none of them are mutually exclusive, right? They kind of sort of all mixed together. That is why it's so complex. So while the end product is simple, you eat more, the reasons why you eat more are very, very, very complex.
Because a lot of people want to point the finger, don't they? They want to say, it's on the individual, it's on the government, it's on the schools. But it can't work like that.
No, it's got to be. It's got to be holistic. It does have to be holistic, because it is a complex problem. Because your genes mix with the environment, and the environment, while there are elements of the environment you can control, your house, for example, most of the environment we wander around in, we have no control over, right? Where we work, our schools, the supermarket we shop in. I mean, we can choose the supermarket we shop in, but once we enter it, we're under the power of wherever the food is chose to be put. So we have to sort of take the whole of society, and therefore the whole of society has to play a role if we want to tackle diet-related illnesses, including obesity.
Absolutely, because it starts young. And that's one thing that I found really interesting as a parent, is seeing how my eldest, who's now 4, if he sees an ice cream van, if he sees ice cream, you know, there's that natural gravitation to, yes, that's yummy, I want that. And if you grow up on a road where there's always a ice cream van, like every day, or there's something, and you can see where problems start. And it starts really young today, doesn't it? Kids are obese from... Is it 1 in 4 now under the age of 5 or 6?
Yeah. So if under the age of 5 or 6, 1 in 4, and that is I want to say it's an average.
Yeah.
Right. Which means that in the poorer sectors of society, it's maybe 1 in 3. Whereas if you go to the more affluent section of society, it could be 1 in 6, 1 in 5. And so the average is bad, but when you actually look at the extremes and look at different sectors of society, it is not good.
So let's talk cost of living. There's a cost of living crisis in the UK. I know you do a lot of work with the BDA. You mentioned in your books as well that it's a privilege to be able to eat well. And I think understanding that...
It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be, but exactly, it definitely shouldn't be. And how have we got to this point where that is the case? And then second of all, how does a cost of living crisis impact our health? Big question.
That's a big question. Let's open with that. I think ultimately, if a cost of living crisis. So in other words, you have people. Let's talk about privilege. Let's start with privilege.
There were 2 there.
And privilege, or socioeconomic status and privilege. People tend to think of it as cash.
Yeah.
And there is an element of cash to it, but I think we have to consider it slightly more nuanced, because I think it is cash. But it's also time, because clearly if you have to work 2 minimum wage jobs to feed your kids, right, you have less time.
Exhausting.
There is knowledge, okay, in terms of how to use certain items of food, because you don't have the time to pick up the knowledge. Ultimately, though, so cash, time, knowledge. And if you mix those 3 together, and what happens is as you go lower down the socioeconomic ladder or up or down, okay, you reduce the amount of those 3 things, and ultimately it reduces choice. And so as you get less privilege, you have less choice. And currently, the main issue is, in this country at least, okay, we have to deal, each country and region has their own challenges, but in this country, the healthiest foods are not the cheapest foods. Ultimately, that is the problem. And so if you have a limited amount of cash, a tenner, you walk into the supermarket, the store, wherever you're going to do to feed your family, you have to feed your family. Whatever the situation is, however many kids, you have to feed your family. And so you have to fit it within the envelope of cash you have. And unfortunately, that overwhelmingly the situation is it is less healthy. And so hence, there is this huge cost of living crisis where the cheapest foods are the least healthy foods, typically, not all the time. That is one of the major drivers.
It is. It's undeniable. And it's actually extremely overwhelming. And it makes you just feel this whole wave. When you were discussing that and you explained the 3 tiers, I just felt sad. You know, I just feel this kind of sadness on how have we got to a state where children just don't have that kind of support, and the parents don't have the support, and the country just seems to be in a bit of a crisis.
And incidentally, when people say, I'll say this, right? I'll say that the cheapest foods are not the healthiest foods.
Yeah.
Always the blowback is, but lentils are cheap, which they are. Chickpeas are cheap, which they are.
Yeah.
Okay. The problem is, chickpeas come out of a tin, but lentils is a classic example where, yes, they are cheap. They're dirt cheap. The problem is, it will always take you, 30 to 40 minutes on a hob to cook a lentil properly.
Yes.
Okay. A, do you know how to do it properly? It's different in India, it's different places to do that, but in this country. And B, do you have the money to pay for the electricity or the gas to cook it? Compared to sticking something into a microwave and zapping it for 2 minutes, it's the same amount of energy for 2 minutes versus for 40 minutes. Can you afford it? So you have to think not only of the cost of the raw item and ingredient
Yeah.
that's in front of you, but everything, the time, the energy that takes to produce it. In that sense, okay, it's far cheaper to buy something pre-made, stick it in the microwave, zap it, and eat it.
Because that was the whole purpose of what we now are discussing in the media a lot as ultra-processed foods. I think that they were designed to help feed en masse, right? Is that predominantly what the food industry... Obviously, the food industry is very clever and multiple things have developed from the original goal of ultra-processed convenient foods. But this discussion has arisen in the last 2 or 3 years massively with ultra-processed foods. And I know as you chair for BDA and you've got roles there with the Dietetic Association here, there's no one definition of ultra-processed foods that we're all told in black and white, this is how to navigate this conversation. So a lot of people call on NOVA, the Brazilian, criteria. Could you break it down for our listeners on why this conversation's emerged and what you think? I'd love your opinion on ultra-processed foods.
So I think the first, why the conversation has emerged is because the vast majority of non-infectious diseases that human beings face today is diet-related.
Yeah.
That's true. Okay, we clearly have infectious diseases, but non-infectious diseases and diet-related illnesses includes obesity, includes malnutrition, includes type 2 diabetes, blah, 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 blah. So diet is something that we have to fix. And I think ultimately that is going to be true. Fine. So then you begin to explore the diet and trying to pick apart, well, what parts of the diet are bad or good for you? Words I don't necessarily like. I think maybe less good or less bad than you is probably a better way of looking at it. And then people like something to blame. Once again, it's fine. Scientists like something to study and intervene with. Be a better way of actually putting it. And that's where the NOVA thing has actually emerged in terms of, well, how foods that are more or less processed. Now, people have ended up on processed foods as a bad thing, but we have to be crystal clear that almost all the foods we eat are processed in some way. Aside from plucking an apple off a tree, okay, cooking is a process. Fermenting is a process, right? Pickling is a process. It's the ultra-processed, the industrial processing that has got everyone's knickers in a twist.
Yes.
Now, and whenever we have this conversation, suddenly I am big ultra, like people think I'm being paid for by ultra processed foods. I'm not. I think the NOVA. Okay, I don't know if you've discussed the NOVA, and interestingly, NOVA, N-O-V-A, is not an acronym. It is just a name that Carlos Montero, who came up with the term, named it. I don't know what actually it means, but anyway, it's not an acronym. So he divided foods just briefly into 4 groups. There's minimally processed foods. There is the sorts of the ingredients, so salt, oil,
olive oil,
something like that. There is the standard processed foods, I think, or when you add group 1 and group 2 together, those first 3. I think they're broadly easy to understand.
And that's like generic cooking, like adding a can of chickpeas into a bolognese where you've got some onion out the freezer that's been chopped and frozen and you're chucking in salt.
Putting in salt or something, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then the major issue is everything else is group 4.
Yeah.
Which means that group 4 suddenly includes more than half the foods we eat.
Yes.
And I think that, so if you actually take that, group 4, which is now ultra-processed, everything in it, and you begin to do science with it, okay, which means that you begin to say, well, on a population level, is it great if we eat a whole bunch of group 4 foods only? So the answer clearly is no, all right, where we eat too much of the group 4 foods. In the UK, on average, 50% of our calories come from these group 4 ultra-processed foods. But then when you then begin to look at the detail, then you begin to say, well, is this word precise enough in terms of, are we really picking out the active ingredients, so to speak?
The one emulsifier, the one preservative.
That are causing the problems? And then you're thinking, well, we're not, right? Because, I think there are probably foods that the vast majority of society will look at and uncontroversially say, maybe we shouldn't eat that much of it.
Yeah, because Dr. Chris Van Tulloken discusses in his book that we're in the 3rd generation of food or something.
That's right.
That's a way of describing it.
There's a 3rd generation of food. And that's fine.
Yeah.
But then there are a lot of foods that are ultra-processed that none of us think are ultra-processed or would not think are ultra-processed until we're told they're ultra-processed.
Yes.
So most breads that are not baked in your house
Yeah.
are ultra processed.
Baked beans?
Most. Baked beans are ultra processed. The interesting thing about ultra processed, so yogurt, plain natural yogurt, is a group 2 food or group 1. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's somewhere in the first 3. But the moment you add something to the yogurt, so for example, you put, there are those square yogurts.
Yeah. I know what you mean, the corner ones.
When the corner one, you
yeah.
put it in and mix it, then it could be a jam, it could be some muesli.
Chocolate things in the
chocolate
corner.
thing. Immediately the whole thing becomes ultra processed.
Yeah.
Like really? I mean, that seems to me, bread is something which, so of the 50% of calories we get from ultra processed foods, half of those calories come from prepackaged bread.
No.
Half. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Now, this could involve, the supermarket loaf. We can debate the standard supermarket loaf.
We love bread.
How tasty that is. Yes, I could go and buy bougie bread and it's going to taste nicer. But ultimately, most of us get supermarket bread. Croissants. Pain au chocolat, brioche, your favorite, Danish pastry.
It's like a French boulangerie, it's everything that would be in a bakery.
And you think, is it really, right? Because ultimately, and so I think the biggest issue for me sits with the bread. There are many other issues as well. But aside from taste, I'm still not convinced in any way, shape or form, right? Aside from taste, that a 1 pound supermarket loaf is actually bad for you. And I think ultimately that's it. Leaving aside taste, okay? Now, people who are fancy and posh and privileged enough, like us, to go buy nice bread, hooray for us. And is it better for us? Does it taste better? Yes. Is it a different thing? Yes. Is it better or worse for us? I don't know. Those are very non-objective characteristics, I think. Now, the argument, to my mind, the argument is that, okay, I think we can agree that if you have stuff that is too high in fat, too high in salt,
loads of chocolate bars
sugar,
every
okay?
day. Yeah.
Right? If you don't have enough fiber, if you don't have enough thing, I think we can sit down and at least talk about that, I think, in a non-hysterical fashion.
Agree.
I think the moment we begin to say that, well, what is the problem with the food? It's the way that it's engineered. So I don't know. I don't see any evidence out there at the moment. Okay, I may be proven wrong, and that's fine. But I don't see any evidence out there at the moment that the way you make the food, rather than what you add into it, actually then makes it bad for you.
I find that so interesting because surely common sense would say it's the quantity of what you eat that matters more than actually
the quantity and the content of it.
Yes.
Okay, I understand that, right?
Yes, exactly.
I completely understand that. And so therefore we need to work within those, within that framework.
Those parameters, because 60% of our diets are ultra-processed foods. That's the stat. So it makes sense that, we just need to encourage a bit more cooking where we can. But how does that leave people that are hearing these scary headlines that, like you described at the beginning, they are working multiple jobs, they're trying to raise families, they do not have the money for the electricity and all those sorts of things. And then they're hearing these headlines about ultra-processed foods. Like, who is doing anything about that?
So they're hearing the headlines, and I think ultimately that this is a very privileged discussion to be having about, what should we be doing this? What's in it? And it is a privileged discussion because at the end of the day, if you don't have the choice, you don't have the choice.
Exactly.
Are you really going to care? I mean, you probably do if you had more headspace, if you had the wherewithal and the resources to care about it. But if you can't, then ultimately you still have to put food into your kids' mouths.
Exactly.
And it sounds a bit weird. And I'm not talking about famine. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, I need to feed the kids. I have money. I have a job. I'm not, this is not biblical famine, which doesn't exist anymore. That is normally a choice. And so I think that ultimately, when you're actually there and you don't care because you got to feed your kids, you're not listening to it at all. So we have this privileged discussion about ultra-processed foods. What then ends up happening is then there is almost a food shaming. Right? There's almost, look, Mr. Smith. Oh, she's had 3 pizzas again today. You may not say it out loud. Some people do. Okay, when you're in the supermarket. The interesting thing about eating is that it is a very public event. Now, aside from in your house, if you eat in a restaurant, people When you're shopping, everyone's going,
What's in their basket?
And we all listen, we're all terrible human beings, and so we judge.
Check out.
But therefore, there is then a tendency to food shame. And I think that to people who don't have the choices that we do.
Yes, I agree. And you said something on one of the first episodes you recorded with Food for Thought that to somebody out there, the greatest reward or something lovely they could give their kid one day would be that bag of whatever they've chosen to buy at the supermarket or ultra-processed food item. And that's something they can do and can give. And it's a big conversation. Thank you for bringing the element up of privilege. And I think it's important for listeners to understand because my inbox has exploded since this ultra-processed food conversation. Everyone's panicking. The worried well is the phrase that we use. But oh my goodness, I'm never going to buy that particular bread again. I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to look at that in that way again. On another element to the conversation, what's your view on ultra-processed foods or industrialized food ingredients making their way into children's foods in schools? Because that's something I find quite interesting. There's, school meals for youngsters. Is there a need for them to be industrialized? Is that something that ideally we would want to be when they're at school every day getting fresh cooked food?
So my son is an adult now.
Yeah.
But when he first went to primary school, I was a little bit naive about this whole system. And I lived that. I'm based in a small little village in Cambridgeshire. We had a nice primary school.
Yeah.
And I was naive. I thought that you went in and you had the school meals and that everything was cooked on site and everything like that. That is very rare. It is, unless you go to a posh school, actually kitchens in a primary school or even a secondary school college are relatively rare. Secondary school maybe because they're bigger and they have larger things. But primary schools almost universally buy their food in from a catering company.
Yes, there's several catering companies.
That come along into it, which is fine. I'm not doing it. And also, then on top of that, how much money do they actually put into the specific foods? They are not a lot of money at all. Okay, and so you have to have this tension of yes, we could afford to pay for meals, but it's heavily subsidized, and so you end up having a situation where the costs are cut down to so low in terms of what is being able to be provided that you do end up with more industrial processing that comes in. Now, we can debate how palatable that is, no pun intended, to greater society. But that is what has happened because not a lot of money goes into primary school and feeding primary school kids. And so ultimately, that is why it'd be lovely to think that there is every day the dinner ladies, the dinner gentlemen come in and everything is chopped up fresh and that's not what happens.
No. And we'll touch on that, I think, a little bit later. But it is important to raise. And I think there's a lot of concerns now that are floating around, which is why I had to have you on the podcast because I knew you would give us this fantastic earthy balance. Let's get real. This is kind
earthy
of earthy and balanced.
Opinionated, annoying.
Have you been described as earthy and balanced before?
No.
Quite like that one, actually.
Yeah,
you should keep that. Anyway, let's move on to the discussion around weight loss injections. Oh my goodness. I mean, where do I start? How do I break this down? They're now being heralded as the solution for the country, or, there's food companies that are making foods designed for people that are on these weight loss injections. It's big. Can you break down what they are, why they may be helpful for some people, and why for others perhaps not so much, and are they a solution? There's 3 or 4 there.
You like to ask multi-part questions.
I do. I'm very bad at that. That is what I do. We'll come back to a few of them if we forget.
So these drugs, and they include the well-known ones. Ozempic is one of them. The chemical name for Ozempic is semaglutide. They include Mounjaro. The chemical name for that is tirzepatide.
Oh.
And they're all modified gut hormones.
Yes.
Now, there are a number of gut hormones in our body that go up after a meal. And these particular drugs do 2 things. They enhance insulin secretion after you eat something, so from your pancreas, which means they are very effective type 2 diabetes drugs, which means that for every given gram of food you eat, there is a better insulin rise, which we don't need because I'm not diabetic or you're not diabetic. But if you are, that's very helpful. So diabetes drugs.
And this is type 2. We're specifically talking about type 2.
Type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes where you still have a pancreas.
Yeah.
Then, because these drugs stay in the bloodstream a lot longer, so the superpower of these drugs are they take these gut hormones, which have a very short half-life, couple of minutes, and put decorations on them and keep them in the blood for longer. Okay, so type 2 diabetes, but then because it's in around for blood for longer, it signals to your brain, okay, and it makes you feel fuller. You feel fuller, you eat less, you lose weight. In some ways, it turned out to be a side effect of these drugs that then they identified. So what these drugs do is they make you feel fuller, and so you eat less. And they are remarkably effective. Now, what is interesting is that these class of drugs have been around for a long time, probably nearly 20 years. No one has known about them before, okay? But because they were a once daily injection for a long time, but they've been around for a long time. Then it was probably, I don't know the exact time, 2020, 2021, actually, the secret sauce was probably a mix of a number of different things. We were all sat on our backsides at home because of lockdown. That's the first thing. And therefore looking at TikTok or whatever you do. And it entered the cultural zeitgeist, for lack of a better term. And they also became a once weekly injection. Okay, and so suddenly it took off like wildfire. And what is interesting about these drugs is that name another drug, okay, about for anything aside from Brufen or Tylenol or paracetamol, Panadol, that anyone can actually tell you a name of. You can say, "Oh, my granddad is on statins," or
that's about it, probably.
But suddenly everyone knows the name of Ozempic. What the freaking hell, right?
Yeah.
But they are very, very effective.
Yeah.
Now, there are side effects. Okay, they make you feel a little bit pukey. Not everybody, but pukey. It sort of messes around with the tail end of your gastrointestinal tract. But that's because that's what gut hormones do.
Isn't there mental health side effects as well? I've heard about depression.
Those are rarer. So what is interesting there about the mental health elements of it, and people are trying to work through the mechanisms, but this so editorial, okay, this is what I think is happening. I think because these drugs make you feel fuller and you eat less, now clearly there are people on the spectrum of, there's some people who are slightly more depressive, some people that are unrelentingly optimistic. I'm an unrelentingly optimistic person, but in the normal distribution of things. But imagine now food for a lot of people is very pleasurable. Okay, it's true. And so imagine if for a small percentage of the population, you suddenly reduce the pleasure they get from food because suddenly you're a little bit fuller.
Yeah.
You can imagine why it might tip a couple of people over thinking about things. Because interestingly, the other side of the thing is that these drugs are also apparently quite effective. If you want to stop smoking, or if you're an alcoholic and want to stop drinking, these drugs help you stop that as well. Wow. And I think it's both ends of the spectrum. Because it removes a little bit, it sort of dampens down just a little bit of the wow you get from certain
coping
things.
Strategy you've had.
I think it makes it easier for you to actually do that. So it's good. So in summary, the drugs are quite safe, actually. We know that they're safe because I'm around a long time. They are remarkably effective. Weight loss 15 to 20% over a couple of years. Okay. The danger is that I think we shouldn't be using them in isolation. So I do think it should be prescription only for many reasons, but for a couple of different reasons. The first is that they're so effective that they work for everybody, whatever your starting weight. If you're 350 pounds and you need to lose 100 pounds, ideal for you.
Which is why the black market rose.
The black market rose. Or if you are a 6 stone, 18-year-old girl. It doesn't matter what your starting body weight is, it will work. So it needs to be on prescription so that people don't misuse it. It can't be used in isolation because it doesn't improve your diet. What it does is it doesn't stop you eating chocolates and burgers. Nothing wrong with chocolate and burgers, but it doesn't stop you eating them. It makes you eat less of them, which is fine, and you do lose weight, but it doesn't improve your diet.
Right.
And so when deployed, it should be deployed with some kind of dietary intervention so that you improve your diet.
You eat.
And finally, and thirdly, if you lose weight quickly, so this is not specific for these drugs, but if you lose weight quickly, if I went on a fast, you will lose equal parts fat and muscle. And no one signs up to lose muscle.
No.
Okay. And the same thing is going to be true for these drugs, which means that you also need to increase your physical activity to maintain muscle mass. So it is effective. It does make you lose weight, but you can't use it in isolation. You have to take into account, surprise, surprise, the rest of your lifestyle as well, including your diet and including your physical activity.
And that's such an important message. But it's like that with so many interventions when it comes to weight. All these factors, they've never changed. It's always lifestyle. You have to change how you sleep, how you move, how you eat, because that all affects your long-term health.
Now, I just want to stress, that doesn't mean these drugs are bad. I think they need to be used appropriately.
Yeah.
They need to be given by a healthcare professional to the person who needs it with the appropriate support surrounding it.
Yes.
This is why it should be prescription only. We shouldn't be going out, at the moment at least, until we know more about these things. And we need to know a lot more about these things for it to be put into boots so that people can go in and get them.
Well, there's the stories of it being a go-to on the NHS already and the funding being there. And I'm hearing all sorts of things on the grapevine. And it's interesting you say that, because surely when people come off, they just put the weight back on, mostly.
They will put the weight back on. But that's probably going to be true for all drugs. The drugs only work when you're on the drug.
Yep.
So you do have to have a longer term battle plan in place once you actually roll these drugs out.
And what about the influence of, so this is really your core kind of thing, genes. When it comes to an individual with certain genes taking this drug or looking at interventions, is there a difference there? Has that been looked at, these key different genes or markers that you could say could predispose somebody to more likely being overweight or obese?
So there's two things there.
Yes.
I think what I study clearly is why people are small, medium, and large in the environment. Now, the question that then leads on to that is, how do those genetic factors influence your response to specific interventions? There will be genetic factors that interventions, not only pharmaceutical, but all kinds of interventions, dietary interventions, everything. Now, there are undoubtedly going to be genetic influences, but we don't know what they are yet.
No.
And the reason we don't know what they are yet is because when you're trying to do genetics, you need two things. You need power. So in other words, you need as many people as possible. But crucially, you need a clean measure. And what I mean by a clean measure is you need a measure which is not subject to any imagination or memory. This is why BMI, imperfect though it is very good to do genetics on, because it's just your weight and your height, waist-hip ratio, things like that, not subject to imagination. The more complicated it becomes, what you eat, that's quite complicated actually, how much you eat, and then whether or not you respond to a specific dose of drug, then it becomes complex. It doesn't mean the genes are not there.
No.
So I think certainly the drug companies that make these drugs want to know who responds, who won't respond, who will get side effects, right? And we all do want to know that.
Yes.
We just don't know it yet.
So it's very early days. It's just such early days. And what about a gender divide? I'm fascinated in this anyway with all areas of research, because I feel like, as we know, men kind of were the main sample size for so many areas of science, especially nutritional science. Is there a difference between men and women responding to things, especially genes? Are you seeing differences in sex divides, I suppose?
It's not only sex divides, there's also age divides.
Yes.
So what is interesting, there are a core of genes that are shared between sexes and ages that influence your body weight.
Yeah.
Okay. But unsurprisingly, there are distinct signatures which mark why some women will end up heavier than men or lighter, different body weight than men. And there are also distinct genetic signatures that mark childhood obesity versus adult obesity.
Wow.
And so we just actually identified a gene just 2 months ago, actually, that is rare within the population, but causes a 4 BMI point increase if you have a mutation in a gene. But population level, 4 BMI, but specific for adult obesity. So no signal in childhood whatsoever. Most of the genes I've worked on through my life means that you end up with a big child, big adult. It's very difficult to become unbig when you become big. But then we've identified a gene now which is specific for adults. And there are genes, which I did not identify, but my colleagues are, which are specific for female obesity versus male obesity. So core genes that are human-wide, But undoubtedly, there needs to be more to be studied about specific reasons about sex, about age, about, yeah.
It's fascinating because any woman listening will say they've always had a harder time with their body fat loss than a man. And that tends to be something we see in the clinic. That's obviously anecdotal, and of course there's cases on both sides, but watch this space. That's interesting.
No, I think definitely watch this space because women are... It's amazing, given that they're 50%, you are 50% of the population, how understudied women are.
I know, it's mad. And I think your new research, you're looking also at brain control, is that correct? So could you discuss a bit of that before I take listener questions as well?
So the brain control comes into influencing our feeding behavior.
Yeah.
All right. And so your brain needs to know two pieces of information in order to influence food intake. It needs to sense your long-term energy stores, fat, how much fat you have, because that's how long you'd last without food.
Yes.
And also what you're currently eating, okay, which comes from your gut hormones. This is how these new class of drugs work.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And we're mapping these circuitries. But obviously, you can't ignore the hormones. No. And what is the biggest difference? I mean, okay, physically, there's huge differences between men and women, but ultimately it's because of the hormones that are there, and the hormones influence how these signals are sensed by the brain. And we know, right? I mean, women are complex, men are very uncomplex creatures. We're born, we think about food, we think about the other thing, we die. That's it. Women, have you been pregnant? Are you pregnant?
Yeah.
Are you postmenopausal?
Yes.
All of these are marked by huge hormonal changes. And then how many postmenopausal women suddenly change shape and they're thinking, I haven't increased what I've eaten. I still do the exercise, which I do. But your hormone levels have changed, which means suddenly the algorithms have changed. Your equation has changed. And so therefore you change shape. And so your hormones play a huge role in just the basic biology of how your brain controls food intake.
Yeah. This is just it. And I find it absolutely incredible we haven't looked at it further until the last decade or so, really. So it just, I guess it's complicated. I mean, where do you even start? How do you measure it?
I know it's complicated, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
No, I know. Well, bring it on is all I can say. And let me just have a look at these questions from our listeners, because one of them was on that with dietary changes and female health. But I feel like we should probably I'd like to start with this question from Diana.
Yep.
Because she's asked you something, and I know it's always difficult as a nutritional scientist or a scientist to say what you do doesn't apply to everyone else. But do you follow a plant-based diet? She said. What are your thoughts of this way of eating?
So I don't follow a plant-based diet. I'm flexitarian. So in other words, I did an experiment a little while ago in which like for a TV show. Where I went a month on a plant-based diet. I probably you know what I missed the most? I missed eggs. I probably like eggs too much. Yeah. To go for
so their plant-based was vegan essentially.
Yes, and it was entirely vegan. So I guess actually what's interesting is I think the definition of plant-based has changed.
It's vegan, it's just more plants. So actually it's not clear. Let's pretend she said, do you follow a vegan diet instead of
because more plants, I try to eat more plants. So the answer is yes. Do I follow a vegan diet? No. Do I think people can be healthy following a vegan diet? Yes. Do I think it is a privileged choice? Yes.
Yes, it's a very privileged choice for all the reasons we discussed earlier on. Any dietary change or lifestyle you're able to suddenly adopt is a privilege to a degree.
And I do draw a distinction between being vegan and vegetarian.
Yes.
Because dairy products and eggs are nutritionally complete, and they're cheap, which means that actually you can be underprivileged and be vegetarian. In fact, for most of our life, we probably were, for most of evolution, we probably were largely vegetarian anyway. Veganism is just a very different thing.
And that's where I think as well, plant-based diets are great for everybody because it is just more plants. You'll save money by eating more beans and pulses and things. You'll still get the protein. And if you're having eggs or dairy and just cutting your meat, it makes sense. Okay. Millie has said, does our diet have to have an exact percentage or ratio of ultra-processed foods to have a negative impact on our health? So like we said, how do you quantify it?
So I think you can't quantify it until we know what the hell they are. So I think if you switch around the question and suddenly ask, is there a minimum amount of fiber and protein and maximum amount of salt, sugar, fat we should be eating? It's going to differ from each individual, but yes, is the answer.
Yeah.
Okay?
No.
And so if you do that, then suddenly, yes, there are numbers that we can play with.
Yeah.
But until we know what a UPF is, each of those are going to be so different. We can't answer that question, but we can answer it with regards to nutritional content.
We can, exactly. No, that was perfectly answered. Now, Daniel said, do you think placing taxes on unhealthy food is a good way to tackle obesity? This is such a big question, Daniel.
It is a very big question. I think, look, I am generally not opposed. I'm generally uncomfortable with legislative effects like this because they tend to do only two things. They tend to disproportionately affect poor people, and then they tend to make lawyers rich. Now, does it mean that we shouldn't do anything? The answer is no. I think taxation has its place, but what we can't do is to make something more expensive without making something else cheaper.
I agree.
Because ultimately, you still go in and you still have your 10 or 20 quid that you're going to feed your family with. You have to leave with the same amount of food.
Yeah.
What you want and what you want to aim to do is for someone to leave with the exact same amount of money with fewer choices, but to leave with healthy food as a default.
Absolutely. It's just not fair. It's a bigger question here. There's so much to think about when that comes into it. And then Lauren... Sorry, Lauren. This is a common thing that lots of people ask. Is it true that our stomach stretches when we overeat and then we require more food to keep us full? So obviously, I think that's something people hear a lot, don't they? That my stomach suddenly doubled in size, therefore I need to eat more. No. That's
not true. So your stomach does stretch very, 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 very quickly, but how much you eat is brain controlled. Very, very little of it is controlled by the stretchiness or any of the organs. Yeah,
absolutely. Then I have one last question before our fact or fiction round.
Yes, ma'am.
I've never seen so much misinformation online ever. I've actually found it quite terrifying when you go onto platforms, especially TikTok, especially Instagram. Do you have any idea of what we can do to make a difference in this area with the role that you lead as well in your life with BDA? And, what can we do and what can people do? Because they're seeing it everywhere. It's very, very difficult.
So this is the problem. Well, it's a good thing in a sense. Not the misinformation. But at the moment, there has never been more diverse sources of information that we can get for free.
True. That's good.
The problem is, there's such a diverse source of information that we can get for free. Previously, for better or for worse, you had to go through some kind of gating. It tended to be called an editor. It tended to be called a publisher. It tended to be something in which you kind of have to go through, and so not all your thoughts could be broadcasted to the world. Whereas now, all your thoughts can be broadcast to the world. I think the genie is out of the bottle. I don't think we can put it back in unless we're countenancing censorship. So I think with my now scientist hat off and chair and president of the BDA hat back on, I think the answer is for people who are experts in diets, whatever your field of it, is to be on these platforms. Not everybody has to be on every platform, but all of us can be on some platform. Now, it could be a platform where you just go to your kid's school and speak at the assembly.
Yeah.
Or it could be you have a huge Twitter following or Instagram following, whatever, and you do it, or you write books, or you are on telly, what have you. And I think we shouldn't shy away, particularly if it's within your skill set. You love to write, you love to speak, you're particularly lucid. Then that's what we do. We make sure that I am an expert, I'm a qualified expert, and now I'm going to say something about it. And you try and fight back in that way.
It is the only way, because the problem is everyone thinks they're an expert. And often the people that are experts would never call themselves experts. Do you know what I mean?
I know.
Yeah, we just don't know enough. I don't know enough. You're definitely an expert in my eyes.
I think there is a very simple rule. If someone says that this is two things, this is the only way to do this for your health, they are almost always wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. The my way to highway thing, almost always wrong because there's no solution.
Or buy my magic pill.
Or buy my magic pill. And if someone says it's easy, just do it this way. That is a little less black and white, but it's seldom easy because life is complex.
What's your thoughts on pills for blood sugar regulation? People selling things without any scientific grounding or basis, and then they're saying, well, every time you eat a bowl of pasta, you should take a concoction to try and reduce your glucose spike.
So I think there are a few things there which I won't take too long about. I think that probably some of these random pills may very well have some active ingredient that is genuine. Just as a lot of traditional medications.
Yeah.
But I think we do have to do that. We have to understand what the active ingredients are rather than rely necessarily only on old wives' tale. It's a very sexist way of saying it, but So I'm not saying all of them don't work, because clearly some of them do. Aspirin came from the bark of a tree that people used to suck on, for example.
Fascinating.
But some of it is probably going to be just that.
Brilliant. Right, we move on to our fact or fiction round.
This.
You all ready? Okay. Obesity is a choice.
Fiction. It might seem like a fact, but it's fiction because an individual meal, which is a choice, doesn't influence your body weight.
Oh, so good. Genes influence feeding behavior and metabolism.
But fact.
We don't have enough information on the long-term effect of drugs like Ozempic for the average non-diabetic person taking it.
Oh, definitely fact.
Our brain hates us losing weight.
Definitely fact.
All ultra-processed foods are bad for our health.
It's now fiction. Now people are going to come in and says, you're pro-UPF, pro-food industry.
We're all sponsored.
I know, we're all sponsored by #UPF people. No, that's definitely fiction.
Okay. As a population, we consume too many UPFs in the UK.
And I think that's fact. Once again, with the proviso that we know what these UPFs are. So on average, we probably are taking too much of their food.
Absolutely. Body shape influences where you store fat, and where the fat you store matters to health.
That's true. Fact.
GLP-1 is the only gut hormone that plays a role in satiety.
No, fiction. So GLP-1, which is the base level for Ozempic, is one of 20 different gut hormones that we actually have in our body.
So amazing. Diet sodas are not bad for our health since they don't contain many calories.
So I'm not going to answer fact or fiction for this, because I think it's a nuanced answer. And the nuanced answer, because diet sodas are good or bad for you, whatever you want to say, compared to what? It's like vaping. Is vaping bad or good for you? Yeah. Compared to smoking, it's not bad for you. Compared to not vaping, it's bad for you. So I think diet sodas probably have a role to play, sitting somewhere between water and a full-fat soda. But I think it's always better just to drink water.
Yep. Calories on food labels are accurate and represent the exact number of calories that will be absorbed by the body.
Fiction. Now, when I say that, this is the other thing that people then throw me. People think I'm anti-physics. I'm not anti-physics. Calories are nutrition blind. That's the problem.
Yeah. Thank you. Fantastic fact or fiction round. You touched on the one thing there about the fact that our brains don't want us to lose fat. And I think for a lot of people, it's such a struggle. A lot of people are desperate to lose body fat, but sometimes you are fighting against something that's really not meant to be swayed. How do you discuss that with a client or a patient that's come to you and they're discussing that with you? How do you explain that with the brain?
So I think there's a couple of things that discuss. First of all, losing weight is never going to be easy.
No.
Okay, whatever size you start from. So some people think, well, yeah, but look at so-and-so there with a six-pack. The problem there is there are a number of situations that could lead to that. Are they overprivileged? Do they have a personal trainer because they can afford one? Or do their genes just make it easier for them? Now, if you happen to be in a situation where there's a whole lot of things, but say biologically it's more difficult for you, it's always going to be more difficult for you. So that's the first thing to actually tell them. Don't give them the real numbers. Say it's going to be difficult. And then the second thing to ask them is, what are your goals? Because the wrong answer is, I want you to look like Angelina Jolie, because, or whatever. I wish I looked like Brad Pitt, but I don't, right? So what are your goals? Okay, define your goals. I want to be able to go up the stairs without feeling breathless. I want to be able to carry my grandkid's child, whatever you want to do. I want to be able to do the couch to 5K because that's what I want to do. Whatever. People have goals. Be specific about the goals and try and hit your weight, your health goals to fulfill that specific goal one at a time. Rather than some notional, I want to lose 5 stone. Yeah. Why do you want to lose 5 stone? because I look like this.
Or the weight, I was my lowest stat. I get that all the time in my whole life when I was a teenager.
Yeah, but if you were a teenager, and you are postmenopausal, just to say, you'll never get there. You will never get there. So I think be goal specific, be realistic with your goals, and think about the health element to it rather than how you look.
Perfect. And I think that wraps up the podcast nicely with a food for thought that we leave for listeners. And I think mine today would be, just don't believe everything you read as gospel, because everything's nuanced to some degree. There's sort of like the discussion we had about Ozempic or even the ultra-processed foods. There's always someone in a different situation to your own. And for anyone listening, I know it can be scary. It's so anxiety-provoking, to hear that something you might be feeding your children might be harmful. Or of course it's a worry. And just try and surround yourself with voices like Giles, come and listen to Food for Thought, things that are just going to put your mind at rest and be like, look, even scientists don't have all the answers. And I think that's probably my food for thought today. If you had a take-home message, Giles, what would it be?
I think the answer is it might seem like it's very complex out there, and in some ways it is. But I think a safe way of dealing with it is variety.
Yeah.
If you mix it up, if you ate only chocolate ice creams every day, clearly that's not great for you. But if you mixed it up, if over the course of a week, don't think about each individual meal as being bad or good for you. If over the course of a week, have you had enough vegetables? Have you had enough meat or protein? Have you had enough thingy? Have you had the cakes? Yes. But if over the course of the week, it's balanced and it's varied, that's probably the safest way to function.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's what you add in. It's not what you take out. Get that fibre in, get the variety of food. Giles, thank you so much for coming on Food for Thought. And where can everyone go to read about your books, to get your books, to see what you do online?
I don't know. I don't have a website. Actually, it's a terrible thing to say. My name is unusual, Giles Yeo, Y-E-O. I'm either a Devonian dairy farmer or someone with Singaporean parents who like to call me Giles. So if you Google Giles Yeo, you'll find all the stuff that you need to find.
It will come up, and obviously we'll link it in the show notes. Giles, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.